Hi, my name's Anna Thurgood and I work at State Library of Queensland. I was the curator of the recent exhibition 22 Decades of Queensland Photography, and you're watching our Curator Talk series, and today we're going behind the lens with Kelly Hussey-Smith and Alan Hill. So thank you very much for joining us, Kelly and Alan.
Hi Anna, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
I'd just also like to remind anyone who's watching that you can leave your comments or ask questions, because Kelly and Alan and I will be online to answer those. So my first question, which I've been asking everybody so far, is for both of you. So I'm just wondering, when or how did you first get into photography?
Sure. For me, it's a bit of a cliched story. My dad introduced me to an old manual Nikon camera, and guess got me interested that way. And I was lucky enough to be able to have the opportunity to be at a high school where there was a dark room, so I was getting involved in processing film and all those kind of exciting technical aspects. And yeah, for me it was just something I kind of took to pretty naturally, and found that I was enjoying for those forthcoming years, and then ended up taking a gap year after school, but then going off to uni and studying for a degree.
Yeah. What about you, Kelly?
Yeah, my story is fairly similar. I inherited my dad's Pentax, and he showed me the basics, exposure and loading film and composition. And from there, I started to photograph a lot. And I think the really special thing about it for me initially was how it helped me kind of look at the world in a way that I previously missed. So look for very nuanced details. And initially it was like the poetic that I was quite interested in, seeing kind of little magical things in the world that otherwise I'd miss in kind of the busyness. And I guess over time, as I became more serious and as I grew up, I started to see also then other things in the world, and I started to see how photography could potentially also image power structures and issues around justice, and how that you could kind of effectively connect the materiality of the world to these kind of abstract forces that kind of impact people's lives quite dramatically.
Yes.
So that's kind of how I got into photography initially, just through the magic. And then it became actually a way of kind of saying things through images.
Yeah. So you're both, well-established practicing photographers who grew up in Queensland but now live in Melbourne. And this might seem like a silly question, but I think one of the things that we were trying to explore in the exhibition is what is it about Queensland? What is it about the Queensland experience that comes through these visual records? So would you say that you've noticed any differences between Queensland and Victorian photographers, documentary photographers?
Oh, right. Well, I probably wouldn't like to draw a comparison necessarily, but I think we both feel privileged to have been immersed in a very strong photographic culture in Queensland, the Queensland College of Art, and then also in and around the Queensland Centre for Photography during its 10 years of operation, and then also, with the State Library actually, especially in later years and projects we're involved with, to kind of engage with the library and its function as a collecting institution and the importance of their visual collections. So yeah, I don't think there's a difference necessarily or a contrast. But it's definitely there is a strong culture in Queensland.
Yeah, well, that's good to know. Just a reminder to everyone that you're watching our Curators Talks Behind the Lens series for the exhibition 22 Decades of Queensland Photography. I'm here with Alan Hill and Kelly Hussey-Smith, whose work is featured in the collection and the exhibition. And just like to invite audiences to leave their comments or ask questions, because we'll be online to answer those. So Kelly, a question for you. You've worked on some social history projects with communities, activist groups, public institutions and NGOs. I'm wondering how this works in practice. Is it a fair amount of co-design and collaboration, or do you have a fairly solid idea of the outcomes you're looking for when you start out on a project like that?
No, these projects are always like inherently, they inherently revolve around kind of process. And I never really have an outcome in mind when the project is a collaboration and when it is co-designed. It's really just initially a process of kind of listening, dialogue, being like properly attentive to that dialogue as well, where appropriate, asking questions, doing as much reading and research around whatever it is that I'm doing. So it's almost like if I'm working with community effectively, or different communities or different individuals, I need to do the work to get up to speed, to have a proper dialogue effectively. And I think outcomes become a conversation when we find those synergies, when I feel like I'm understanding what it is, you know, that we're talking about in a richer way. And when we start to see that potentially we could put our knowledge together, our skills together to kind of find that issue that we want to kind of communicate then through the visual or through writing or through whatever the project is. So it's really attentive to process, and I'm a frustratingly slow photographer, yeah, I think in many ways. But I really value that, and to me it's a form of resistance also against the constant busyness and the expectation to produce things very quickly, sometimes without deep thought. And to me it's really important, if it's a collaboration, that time has to be time, you know, deadlines exist, but we have to be flexible with time. And to me it's about also time allows me to take a lot of care with what I'm doing, and so not to rush through and be so outcomes driven. But yeah, the outcomes are hugely important, but they can never be predetermined, because you don't know what you don't know effectively before you start. And the other thing is, because I mean, everyone has ideas when they start. No one's like empty, kind of totally empty vessel or anything. But often I find those early ideas I throw out very early on and realize that they're problematic, or they're naive, or they've kind of totally missed the point, because there's so much knowledge in communities.
I think it's really great that as a photographer, you're sort of giving these communities or these groups agency in telling their own story as well. I think that's really important.
When I've, like in the past, worked with like really strong advocates and activists, I mean, they're already telling their story. They're absolutely across the details, but collaborating with, I guess, a documentary photographer or someone coming from a different background then opens up new possibilities for how to get that out, or how to narrow down some of the concerns and be targeted and strategic about getting those things out as well.
My next question is for you, Alan. So I love your project on the Fringe about the suburbs spreading out and intersecting with what used to be rural landscapes. I'm not sure what year this project happened, but I remember that time when, and I presume these photos were taken in and around Brisbane. I remember that time when Brisbane was rapidly expanding out into areas that I remember being quite close to the city but quite rural. And I just wondered what inspired you to make this series of photographs.
Yeah, sure. That particular project started after I'd moved to Cannon Hill. So yeah, previously I'd been living in Logan actually. And yeah, you know, it's kind of, Cannon Hill's an interesting place, and as you say, this was, I guess, early 2000s. And you know, it's a relatively old suburb, you know, by Australian standards, by Brisbane standards. But at that time, there was a lot of infill, a lot of subdivision happening in what would have been, you know, semi-rural spaces. So yeah, I just it came from a kind of, again, a natural process of just like a way I really like to work, which is just to go walking with a camera and, you know, exploring the space around me. It's, you know, that way of working for me brings together, you know, an interest in like the politics of space, and how we kind of construct and organize our world. And also, you know, sometimes a sense of humor or kind of, you know, a sense of interest in the banal as well. And yeah, I guess to speak about people through the spaces they create is something that I've kind of long been interested in. So the idea of a social landscape. So yeah, that's where it came from. It's got a whole mix of things in it. It's sort of a project that will probably always be happening in the background somewhere. Nowadays, I do a lot of that kind of walking and observational stuff on Instagram, because, you know, although it's not without its problems, it's a nice space to create a kind of visual dialogue, and visual conversations can emerge without necessarily having to be working intensely on a big project for an exhibition or something, that you can just fit it into your daily life. Is that process of looking and sharing and yeah, I guess with a critical kind of sensibility about the world we live in.
Yes, yeah. Just a quick reminder, you're watching at the 20 Curators Talks Behind the Lens series, and today I'm here with Alan Hill and Kelly Hussey-Smith, two of the photographers featured in the exhibition. And just to let you know, please feel free to leave comments and ask questions, because we'll be online to answer those. So this brings me to the exhibition, and quite a few photographs from your Central Queensland project I ended up selecting for the exhibition. It's sort of an area that's close to my heart. Can you tell us how this project, particular project, came about and what you were interested in capturing here?
Sure. Yeah, the Central Queensland project emerged out of an earlier project we'd done, which we called Discover Our Spirit, which was focused around the Bundaberg region, and the title comes from the sort of slogan of the council up there. So we've been visiting up there. Kelly has family in the area, so he's making a number of trips into the region, and decided that, you know, car trips, so we'd be like have a bit of time to make images, and started a little project which led to a small publication. And I guess, yeah, as you're picking up, you know, we tend to work on these long projects over time, and things sort of, one thing leads to another, and they're kind of responsive to our, you know, our particular environment and context. And so being there, we started to obviously think more about the broader region out into Central Queensland, and Bundaberg being on the edge of that, and sort of, I guess, some of those things coming through there, but really, you know, an enormous kind of activity. We were aware of this enormous activity in Central Queensland around mining, and around, you know, this is sort of the height of the boom, 2010, 2011, 2012, when we were living in Brisbane, and really aware of how much this kind of economic powerhouse out in Central Queensland was, you know, it was evident in Brisbane. You could feel the money coming into Brisbane, but the actual specifics of what that looks like was quite invisible. So that was really the fundamental premise, I guess.
And I think, you know, like words like diado, drive in, drive out, and fly and bow, fly in, fly out became a part of the vernacular. And this change happened very quickly. And we started to wonder what that meant for labour practices and labour laws, and how that was connected to kind of the capital of the region. And we were, you know, we felt it was kind of a story of our time, a really important story, but it wasn't effectively invisible, what was kind of happening. And so we kind of, you know, long story short, started to do some research, decided if we wanted to do this and take this on as a project. And then, as you would know, started to research like accommodation options and finance the project, and realized that, you know, a tiny motel room anywhere near a mining region was up to 350, 200, 350 a night, and also just completely booked out by all the mining companies anyway. So there was effectively no accommodation. So we realized to do the project, we would have to buy a camper van. So we would be totally self-contained. So it was like a really big decision, and it was like a long-term, you know, a long-term decision where we did the research, we committed, we moved out of our apartment, we got rid of most of our stuff, some stuff we put in storage. We bought the camper van and then kind of embarked on the project. Again, not knowing what we were necessarily going to find or who we were going to meet or how we were going to tell this story, but being, I guess, open to that project, and you know, in that sense, it's very practice-led, what we do.
So what did you discover? What did you learn about Central Queensland through that project?
A lot.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, obviously many things. I mean, we hadn't really been to most of those places before. Interestingly, we were able to trace some sort of definite family lineages for both of us, which is quite an interesting part of it as well. But I guess at the end of the day, the project was always intended to be an exhibition, which we held initially at the Brisbane Powerhouse. And that was sort of something that we'd arranged as part of the preparation. And so, you know, with that, and I guess had a kind of link to the idea of creating a dialogue between the region and the capital as well, and particularly interested in the Brisbane Powerhouse as a venue, as a former power station, but also as such a really public venue, as a way to kind of create a dialogue. And then the show then went to Bundaberg and Emerald as well to try and then work back, which is an important principle for us.
It was also just it was really important to us that like the work, it wasn't really like designed for a commercial gallery output or anything. It was really, we thought, relevant to just kind of public discourse, and so we wanted it to be in spaces where it was accessible, it was free, and where people would just stumble across it because they were coming to the Powerhouse for another reason, not necessarily to see the work. It was also published in a Sunday magazine, which had like a huge readership as well. So we were very interested in kind of getting it out as a work that raised a series of questions.
But in terms of what we sort of, you know, what we learned, I guess there was, I guess, about sort of three main areas which the exhibition was kind of structured around. And yeah, we can talk so much about, but this idea of transition and change was central to the Bundaberg work and the Central Queensland work, in terms of trying to capture this sense that things are changing, a transition, a particular moment in time. So for us, that was around the three kind of key things were like the changing landscape. So we had a couple of themes in the show around extraction. So particularly, obviously, coal was, you know, synonymous with Central Queensland in a way. But also the transmissions that we're interested in, power lines, and also those gas pipelines that we discovered. One of the most visceral visual things that we discovered, and we probably weren't overtly that aware of beforehand, was there was a really intense period of building these gas pipelines, and just really finding them all over the place while they were being, buried. So there's huge piles of dirt, pipelines everywhere. But of course now it's all underground and you can't see it anymore. And I guess, the transmission thing was an important link again, to be like, well, as the way we're kind of implicated as residents of Brisbane or Australia, there's this movement of coal out of the ground, offshore. There's a movement of electricity, from those power stations into the city, and of course the wealth. So that was one part of it. There was also, and they're all interconnected, obviously, but labour practices, and so that was another sort of thing we're looking for in terms of different shifts in labour practices, and so that was a key kind of idea. And then,
so I guess specifically the the mine's operating 24 hours a day, so the mine's never stopping, so the dust literally never settles. The new conditions of work in the FIFO economy of however many days on, sometimes 2 weeks on, 1 week off, and how that impacted local communities, where those people lived, in the mining camps often. What else?
Yeah, all sorts of things. I mean, you know, all different communities that you don't hear about. I think one of the things for us was like there's this idea of the FIFO worker who's getting paid huge sums of money to drive a truck. But I guess for us, we were meeting young people in the region. We're meeting people who were, you know, a particular guy called Greg who introduced us to the idea of the Caterpillar cowboy. So he's you know, he described himself as a farm boy, a country kid who happened to drive a Caterpillar during the day. So it wasn't, you know, these other narratives that weren't kind of particularly prominent at the time or well understood.
And I guess also, yeah, the broader FIFO economy. So I think initially we just thought FIFO workers were miners. And then we realized there's all these periphery industries of FIFO hospitality workers, FIFO security guards, FIFO administrators, FIFO sex workers. So there's this whole other industry that's shifting the way, not just the way miners are working, but how many industries are working in the region.
Yeah, it's an incredible world that I think, you know, I learned a little bit about it because I lived in Mackay for a long time, and I didn't work at the mines, but it was all pervasive. And I came back to Brisbane to visit my family, and nobody had any idea really what was going on up there. So I'm really grateful that that has been documented, especially that moment, because it was a boom. It was an extraordinary time with construction and all that sort of stuff. So I'm really thankful that that people like you have documented it so thoroughly, so well, showing the contrast too. Like I love the photos in the caravan park with this really sort of run-down accommodation, and then you've got the brand spanking new MAC camps, the workers' camps. So yeah, it's an amazing, a whole other world that people don't really know about. We haven't got much time left, unfortunately. So I just quickly think I will ask you about what are you working on now? What's your latest projects now? Just really quickly in a nutshell.
Okay. Sure. So we both work at RMIT, and that's important just because they're the projects we're working on at the moment. So at the moment, I'm really interested in and focused on thinking about documentary education and how we can do that better than we have been, and particularly around issues around kind of ethics and collaboration. And also kind of recognizing the long-term ethos that has kind of been a part of some documentary practices for a long time, but it's been kind of ignored. It's a bit of a blind spot. It's been a bit under-theorized. So I'm working on, for example, I run a project called the Photo Lab, which is in Collingwood, suburban Melbourne, where students kind of work with community partners and co-design outcomes based around kind of the partners' kind of intrinsic motivations, and again kind of employing those same kind of practices and kind of listening and dialogue, and the outcome being driven by that collaboration, not by kind of one's ego or one's expectation or the tropes of any particular world. So I'm kind of working on that in a kind of theoretical way, but then also applying that through this project. So that's kind of one of the projects. I mean, you're involved in that project as well, but I'm kind of at the coalface. But we also do a project together that maybe you can talk about, led more by Alan, which is called Doing Visual Politics. So it's reframing a little bit of documentary to kind of encompass a broader range of practitioners and ideas around the idea of visual politics rather than kind of words like documentary that kind of tend to limit the debate.
Yeah, I mean, that's partly a bit more internationally focused, that project. So we have collaborations with friends and institutions, particularly in South Asia. And Shihab Uddin is also in the exhibition around, visual politics and I guess the civil potential of photography, which, as Kelly said, we're sort of trying to integrate into all of our teaching and our research. And I think that's the exciting thing for us at the moment, is that all these things actually fit together. They don't, it's not an either or situation, but there's many overlaps and intersections, and and I guess still just the general kind of interest and involvement in community and community building, and particularly people who are interested in the visual. People both very locally and globally.
Yeah. Well, there's so much more that we could talk about. I've got lots of questions floating around in my mind, but unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there for today. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for being part of our Exhibition 20.
No, thank you.
Our pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye.